Hi, everyone. Well, we're here online tonight, and so I recorded this video lecture for you. It's not too long, I don't think, but I just really wanted the chance to make sure that we had a chance to talk about some of these emerging student groups because they're really important to me, and I know they're really important to you as well. So let's make sure that we're paying close attention to these groups. Maybe not. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. On the discussion board, you are going to find an opportunity to, if I can get the slide. Oh, I'm not in the slide. Hold on one second. There we go. You're going to find an opportunity to discuss your final project. So if you have any questions about your final project, or if you just want to get some feedback on your final project, you can click the discussion board in Canvas, where you'll have the opportunity to share the name of your character and the show or movie that they're from and the theory that you're planning to use or the theories that you're considering. In that discussion board, you might want to say what theory or theories you use that make it appropriate. You might want to say what evidence you see of growth in the character with regard to those theories. And then if you have any questions about how to apply those theories to your character's experiences, put them in there. I will try to check that discussion board every couple of days. I will not be checking it on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, but I will check it the first beginning of this next week and then at the end of fall break. And when we get together again next week, we'll talk about it in class one last time before we do the presentations on the 9th. So be sure if you have any questions that you talk to me before you get up to give your presentation. I will give you feedback in class after your presentation that you can apply to your paper, but I would really like you to have the opportunity to apply any feedback to the answers to questions you might have before you do your presentation if you want it. Also remember that there's rubrics for both the presentation and the paper located in Canvas. All right, well, that's our class plan for tonight, but canceled. Okay, so housekeeping, here's a few things to know. Course evaluations are coming soon. They're coming on December 5th, and they'll be out there until December 10th. So you'll have 5 days to complete them. Why should you complete a course evaluation? First, I use course evaluations to improve this course for future students and for my own individual teaching. And so if you have feelings about this course, you really love it, you really hate it, there was a reading that you thought was amazing, there was a reading that you thought was terrible, you want to change assignments, you want to change the way we do things, you just have a lot of feelings about it, please fill out the course evaluation and tell me so I can make changes to this course before next fall and save your colleagues in this program future drama, right? Make it better for them. Second, it'll help me be a better teacher too, which I really appreciate. There's also an opportunity for you to interact with me anonymously about how you feel about this class, and I would love your feedback, but you're welcome to give me feedback directly if you like as well. Next week, there's no class, it's fall break. Please take some time to relax, listen to the assigned podcast. There is a podcast for next week. It's a really good one, so I hope you'll enjoy it. Catch up on the reading and then work on your final project. And then on December 2nd, we're going to be doing Emerging Areas of Research Part 2. We're going to be doing student athletes. We're going to be learning about rural students with my friend, Dr. Ashley Stone, who's going to be joining us in class. It's going to be a really good conversation. And we're going to be talking about social class and the ways that social class impacts students' identity development. And then remember, annotated bibliography number 2 is due on December 7th, and reflection number 7 for emerging areas is due on December 5th. Okay. All right. Now, tonight we're talking about 3 areas of identity development: disability identity development, veterans identity development, and social media or digital identity development. So let's jump into disability and identity development. Okay, a few things just before we get into modeling or theories. Access to college for disabled students has steadily increased over the years. Most disabled students begin enrollment at community college, or at least that's how it's been in the past, though enrollment at four-year colleges and universities is increasing as the services improve at four-year colleges and universities. Hold on, I have some notes here. I want to make sure I'm getting to them. Okay. Impairments, like many aspects of our identity, can be visible or invisible, and you may remember reading about that in the reading. It's really important for us to remember that disabled students, we may not be able to see the disability that they have. And so, first of all, we need to remember that there may be physical disabilities or maybe learning disabilities and other disabilities as well. So as we're thinking about the accommodations we need to make for students on campus, the physical spaces, as well as the learning spaces, we need to be taking all of those things into account. Second of all, we need to really be thinking about this next idea, which is the idea that disability is a social construct. And that really goes to the idea of ableism and privilege. So thinking back to the ABIS reading on crip theory, last week when we were talking about compulsory heterosexuality, ABIS really talked about that this week in her chapter and the idea of compulsory ableness. So thinking about the ways that both able-bodiedness and able-mindedness are the ways that our society have said are the ways to be normal, and that those are the ways one's body and mind should be, and that those outside of those standards are seen as abnormal, less, or unworthy of notice. And so because of that, in our society, we have set up our systems, right, so that our communities have, so that our disabled communities have been forced then to ask for accommodations, have been forced to request changes to their learning situations, to their physical situations, their physical living spaces, rather than having the expectation that those spaces should be already prepared for them, because they're then being seen outside of the norm, right? So what crip theory allows us to think about, and what hopefully as we're thinking about disability and identity development allows us to think about, is the ways that we can create more normed spaces for disabled students. So within, sometime I catch my breath here. Within relationships, our normative understanding suggests that there is a forced intimacy. Okay, this is really good. So I have to think how I want to say this. So because of the way that we have compulsory ableness, this means that we have that folks within the disabled community, both with invisible identities and visible identities, there is a sense of forced intimacy, because we've required folks to disclose their identities and their needs to others when they shouldn't have to, right? So thinking about that for physical needs, we've asked people, they have to ask for accommodations, physical accommodations, and sometimes this means that they need actual physical touch, so physical intimacy in order to get into a building or into a space, into a room, because the room's not accommodating for their physical disability. Or we've asked students to reveal their emotional, mental, or learning disability to someone with whom they don't have an actual relationship with in order to receive some sort of accommodation. And so in order for them to get basic access to some other sort of service, we've required them then to have some sort of intimacy. So I think these ideas are really important. And for me, at least, thinking about them in this way of this forced intimacy was a really new way of thinking about the ways that compulsory ableness has disadvantaged folks with physical and I'm trying to think of what our other learning disabilities is what I'm going to say right now. But in the ways that privilege and oppression have perpetuated these social constructs of disability. And so I think what we need to think about is, why might someone not report their disability to OSD, for example? What challenges might they encounter in that process that would discourage them from reporting their disability? Maybe it's the fact that they have to have that forced intimacy with someone in OSD they've never met before. Maybe it's the fact that they have to go through a lot of paperwork or a lot of bureaucracy in order to receive maybe an accommodation. Maybe it's the fact that they have to go through all of that paperwork with someone that they've never met before in an office that seems foreign to them, to then later have to then explain it all to a professor again. So I think we need to begin to think about, what can faculty or services on campus provide with regard to accommodation, even if students have not reported their needs. So what kind of universal accommodations can we provide on campus that are available to all students, regardless of their disability or ability, that don't require students to report ability levels. And then the last thing, that was a lot, guys. The last thing then is to remember that disability identity is fluid. And that's really important because disabilities may not be permanent in regards to time. So students may take on a disability identity with regard to a temporary physical injury or physical situation in particular that may not lead to a permanent identity. And that's the case in one of our case studies actually for this week. So let's think about then a critical disability theory. It's an intersectional approach to impairments and multiple areas of oppression. So if we think about critical race theory, this is a companion theory through a lens of disability. It has 4 key tenets. And if we think about what we know about the lens of critical race theory that we've talked about as a guiding principle or a guiding paradigm for this class previously, these tenets should sound familiar. So first of all, to incorporate voices of disabled people in the solution finding process. As we think about, for example, that question of what accommodations can we provide within campus for folks that need them, even if students have not reported their needs. That's not a question that myself, as someone who's able-bodied and I guess able-minded, not from this question, from this lens of crit theory, that's not some answer that I can define myself. That's a question that needs to be answered by folks who identify as disabled. So those voices need to come into the conversation to say, these are some accommodations that we can offer on campus that would make learning and that would make physical spaces easier to navigate. Second, to resist the emphasis on individual deficiency or impairment, rather than focusing on individual identity descriptions, thinking about individuals as a whole, individual wholeness. Third, identify regulatory practice and policies that further oppression. This really harkens back to the idea of critical race theory, right? So really focusing on policies and practices that further oppression of the people group that we're thinking of. And finally, criticize and critique organizational structures that further segregation of disabled people. And so then lastly, thinking about disability and identity development from an intersectional perspective, we want to be remembering that disability diagnosis may be influenced by other identities. Disability diagnosis, especially with regard to things like learning disabilities, does not happen in a vacuum. If we looked at the rates of disability diagnosis and we cross-referenced that with other identities, for example, if we looked at ADHD, rates of diagnosis and gender, we would see that boys are significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. That may not necessarily be an accurate diagnosis, but it's definitely, that's the diagnosis within the medical community. So we need to recognize that those disability diagnoses are influenced by other identities as well. And so recognizing that individuals' other identities may also influence the diagnoses that they carry, and that how they receive those identities and how those diagnoses are expressed on campus may change as well. And then finally, as always, we need to recognize that there are within group differences for every different kind of identity type. All right, so let's think about the Forber-Pratt model. Within both the Patton et al. Text and the text we read from the Killam-Dagus-White chapter, they had a lot of different models. We're going to briefly focus on the Forber-Pratt et al. Model for 2 reasons. One, it's the most current model, and I think that it does a really good job of capturing, this is number 2, I think it does a really good job of capturing an identity development model that is simple. It's applicable to all different types of disabled students, and it has a way for students who even are temporarily disabled to work within this model. So briefly, you can see it on the screen. It starts with stage 1, which is acceptance. Forber-Pratt suggests that students may experience stages of grief, like the Kubler-Ross stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. I think that this, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about that particular way of identifying the acceptance stage. For students who have experienced their disability earlier in life, that stage 1 might happen obviously much earlier. And for some, that experience of acceptance may look significantly different than someone maybe who experienced a life-altering disability later in their life, or right before college, for example. The stage 1, in the stage 1, as they move through stage 1, they accept the disability, and important others in their life accept it as well. And I think that's really important as we think about what we know about other identity development models, that important others in the person circle have an acceptance as well. It doesn't have to be everyone, but that there's other people who are accepting of that individual's identity, just as I'm accepting of my own identity. As we move into the relationship phase in stage 2, the individual begins to meet others with disabilities and create relationships and learn norms and activities. Now, one critique of Forber-Pratt is that it may be biased towards visible disabilities. That being said, there is, even since 2013, a significant movement towards creating cultures and communities on college campuses and in social media of those who have unseen disabilities. And so I think there's an increased opportunity for students with invisible identities to have these opportunities to create relationship and learn norms and activities on campus and off campus in this relationship phase. In stage 3, the adoption phase, individuals internalize the core values of independence and social justice within the disabled community. They develop a peer group community, they find places for strategy and advice, and they begin self-advocacy as well as collective action. They don't necessarily have to do both to go through this stage, but they may develop one or the other or both. And then finally, in stage 4, giving back to the community, you might see leaders and role models emerging from stage 3 into stage 4. Individuals who work with youth or other students. And that's really where we see identity synthesis occur. So like with other identity development models, you might see individuals begin to pull themselves kind of in a place where they're taking ownership of their own identity. Their disabled identity becomes just one other factor of their identity, just as their other identities do as well. Its salience becomes equally weighted with their other identities depending on the circumstance that they're in. Now, the challenge of this particular stage is that it may be externally applied to others as those who get it compared to those who don't get it yet. So there may be some judgment in stage 4 as people look out to the community of those who do and don't get it. So I'm going to take a short break and get back to you in just a minute. All right, so in the discussion board, you're going to take all this information that I just rattled off to you so fast. I know it's really fast, I'm sorry. But you've read it all, so you are all familiar with all of this. And you are going to take one of these 2 case studies. So when you go to the discussion board, you're going to click it, the case study discussion board, and there's going to be 2 case studies. One is for Paloma and one is for Melanie. You see Paloma on the screen right now, and then there's Melanie. You're going to pick one of the 2 case studies, read the case, they're very short, and then answer the questions. The questions are a little bit different, so don't read Melanie and answer Paloma's questions. All right, just click the one you're going to read and then answer those questions. And then reply to the people that answered your person's questions. So make sure you say which person you answered in the discussion. All right, now let's talk about veterans. So you listened to Chelsea O'Brien on the podcast, and Chelsea, she's working on her doctorate now. I don't remember where she's at now. I think I put it in the Canvas. she's a fun follow on Twitter if you want to follow her. She had some data on student veterans, or she felt like schools don't really keep track of student veterans, and that may be true for the most part, but here is some current data on veterans, at least through 2018. 75% of veterans enrolled in college were enrolled full-time in 2018. 52% of those were enrolled as undergraduates, with 24% in 2-year programs, or sorry, 52% in 4-year, 24 in 2-year, and 9% as graduate students. So that's a little higher than the numbers that she was citing in 2000. I think her numbers were for 2014. 56% at public institutions. And this is much higher than the number she was citing. But again, it's later than the data she was citing. 27% at for-profit or proprietary institutions. And that sounds right to me, 27% at for-profit institutions, because I think those places like University of Phoenix and DeVry have really gone after the veterans population pretty strongly. So I would trust these data as more recent and accurate data. Most student veterans are non-traditional. In 2018, at least 85% were between 24 and 40 years old. 47% were parents and 47% were married in these studies. 73% identified as male student veterans, 27% as female. 60, and according to this study, so just the study that they gathered data from in 2016, 60% of the undergraduate student veterans identify as white, 16% is Black, 15% is Hispanic, 3% is Asian, and 7% as other or multicultural. I quoted this specifically because of the way they categorized the races. I didn't like it, so that's why I used quotes. And then 62% were first generation college students. You can click the link on the slide to see where the sources of their data are and read more from the PNPI. The other thing I wanted to talk about from Chelsea's podcast, I wanted us to just like make sure that was in your ear, was the idea of how how veterans are able to transfer their GI Bill benefits. And so I think she's exactly right that not all veterans are using their GI Bills to do their own college study. Many veterans are transferring their GI Bills to their dependents or to their children dependents, to their spouse dependents, or to their ex-spouse dependents. And so keep that in mind as we're thinking about the right ways for us to be tracking student veterans in college. It's not just by use of the GI Bill. And I think that's a really important point that she was making. Okay, so let's talk about these two models that we read about in Vachi's article. Vachi? She said it in her podcast. I think it's Vachi's article. So the first we're going to talk about is Hammond's combat veteran conceptual identity model. Now, in my version of it, I wrote a lot of arrows, but honestly, I couldn't figure out how to do that really fast for our impromptu lecture. But you can see like I have a bunch of arrows marking how I think this works. If you can see my little tiny, in the little tiny picture on the lecture. Okay, so listen closely and imagine the arrows as I'm talking. In this model, we can see how veterans are continually renegotiating their identity throughout the transition from combat veteran to civilian. Couldn't remember that word, civilian. Throughout the transition, this model includes 4 components with an intersecting 5th internal component, the veteran's core identity. Starting from the left, maybe I can annotate it. Ooh, exciting. Okay, starting from the left over here, we can see the veteran is interacting with the external environment and individuals creating a tension between their own perceived sense of self over here. It's like their perceived sense of self. So imagine like all the external environments like pushing against them over here. So the environment creating a tension between their own perceived sense of self and others' perceptions of themselves, which creates this inferred perception of self right here, and then is pushing in towards their core identity. On the right, we see how the core identity here and the sense of self, it was in my place, may inform the veteran's perception of others. in particular for those veterans who see themselves as older or more mature than their peers, which may be a lot of them. If you've been in combat and you come back to the campus environment, you may really have a sense that you're more mature or that you've had a lot more life experience than an 18-year-old who's just come from high school and they're interacting on campus. This can lead to frustration or exasperation or feeling unheard or misunderstood on campus, and can create a barrier to creating relationships with others who aren't veterans. So you can see like this could be a really big barrier to really creating a strong relationships with others on campus. Now at the bottom, Hammond lists this connection to other veterans, showing how the community and camaraderie experienced with other veterans can influence the core identity and sense of self. So that's Hammond's combat veteran conceptual model right there. To the right is Diamond's adaptive military transition theory, and it helps us understand the process of moving from soldier or military member to civilian, from over here, soldier over here, to civilian on the right. Schlossberg's theory of transition and others help us understand the fluid nature of transition, that timing and intensity may be different for everyone, but this theory helps us understand how the process might work for veterans in particular. Adaptation represents when the veteran here begins the transition from service person to college student, and that's typically in the first semester, that transition of, oh no, what did I get myself into? Passage, so this process here, this arch, is where the veteran becomes a student. They establish a routine, they form relationships, and they begin to sort of get it on campus. They may begin to seek support now from various ways. This can last for numerous semesters. And if you remember from the article, like some people are going to have like a really fast and then a really long experience there. Others are going to have a really long, like really slow buildup, and then they're going to, kind of come right back down there. So there's a lot of different ways that trajectory can go. Finally, arrival occurs down here as the veteran moves towards their civilian career choice and acceptance of life as a civilian. At that point, the individual willingly faces change and heads off into their new experience. What I really liked about Diamond's theory was this idea that there is this transition from the mindset of my career at my military career to my civilian career. And that there's this process in between, which is the collegiate experience of training me for my civilian career that happens, and that arrival here is the time when I become this, whatever it is. And so in Diamond's adaptive transition theory, it's really more about an individual's vocational identity as much as it is about their personal identity. And I think that's really important, because even though we recognize that the military experience is a lot about retraining an individual in their identity experience, it's also really a lot about their vocational experience. And when they get into the collegiate environment, they're often thinking about what their next vocational steps are. And so we can't just be thinking about their life experience as a veteran. And if you remember from Chelsea's podcast conversation, there was a lot of conversation about how most of what veterans hear about is like, tell me about your time in Iraq, right? Which first of all is a microaggression, and second of all is completely inappropriate. So let's think about how we can really help our veterans think about this new vocation and experience that they're about to have. And I think Diamond's military transition helps us think about that. Okay, so just to wrap these up, these are some summary thoughts in case we needed to have this, because you all were actually going to explain these theories to me. So just a reminder, veterans are continually renegotiating their identity. They have multiple identities: student, soldier, citizen, peer, partner, parent, child, right? All of those things happening at once. Just like the rest of us, they're continually renegotiating those identities. These negotiations are fluid along with the external environments, and they may influence each other's identities. External environments are going to influence their perceptions of self and others, and their navigation from service life to civilian life may vary in time and intensity and focus. There's 4 key areas of support that Vachi suggests. Services, we need to make sure there's trained staff who are knowledgeable about government paperwork and processes. So if your campus does not have a veteran center, we need to make sure that there's people on campus who are trained to handle those things. We need to think about the transitions to and through college. We need to make sure there's peer support on and off campus. And we need to think about how the academic interactions are happening in and out of class. All right, and as we get ready to wrap things up, the last things we're talking about tonight is digital identities. So we read an article by Paul Gordon Brown, and in that we talked about how students co-construct their digital identity with others within the digital space. So within the digital space, I am able to create who I want to be. So here's an example. I have this Twitter presence as Dr. RP, right? And I have slowly met all these other faculty on Twitter, mostly during the pandemic, because I couldn't go to my academic conferences. I couldn't see any of my friends. I was just out here on my computer on Twitter. And now I know these people on Twitter, right? And so I have become a Twitter academic. Now, mostly I'm just a Twitter lurker who knows these other Twitter academics. But I have figured I have to figure out what my identity is there, right? So while I'm out there in this Twitter space, learning from these folks, I'm learning from them how to construct my identity as a Twitter academic, while they're showing me what their identities are. And they're constructing their identities by seeing what I like and don't like, and what I respond to and don't respond to. And so this co-construction is happening in this interactive space. And I'm an old person. So imagine how that's happening to our 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. Our friends, enemies, present and future employers, schools, romantic partners, all those folks are coming around to shape how our incoming college students and our current college students are co-constructing their identities within the digital spaces. At the same time, those spaces are also being used for digital reputation building. Now, that's also how I'm using the Twitter space, right? And how my colleagues are using the Twitter space. I'm always thinking, ooh, if I say this, what if the chancellor sees it? Or if I say this, what if someone sees, do I want to make sure that someone sees that so that they hire me someday to speak in their class, or hire me someday to give a keynote? So we're always also thinking about personal branding, right? Especially in the age of the influencer. So that's really these two main ideas of digital identity. They're kind of warring against each other, right? How are we constructing ourselves to be authentic? At the same time, how are we branding ourselves? Now, digitized development says there's a way to make sense of and reflect in the online environment, and it's related to our own personal development. We need to recognize how our behavior relates to others and to their own behavior. And for some of our students, they're not there yet. They're just not their prefrontal cortex is not even ready to recognize that the people on the other side of the screen are human people, and that I'm a human person. And so, and sometimes we're not even ready to recognize that, right? In our emails to each other. So recognizing that, that we need to help our students learn how to communicate that way, both in the social media space, in our professional communication space, and learning how to provide those services to students too, both through places like the Writing Center, the Career Center, academic advising and support. Those are going to be the places that we can provide those services to students. So before you go to the discussion board, I want you to make sure you watch this video from Paul Gordon Brown. It's just 15 minutes. So that's expectation before you write in the discussion board. These questions for best practices are in the discussion board. This is the last slide. So after you watch the video, take these questions and respond to the discussion board. Have a great week. Happy Thanksgiving. Bye, everyone. That was an abrupt ending, but I like you. Goodbye. See you on December 2nd.